me to go ahead. There we go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you in Zoom land. And I know there are still a few of our members who are participating early on who, if any of you know them personally and want to reach out and just invite them back into this process, I think we're getting to that point where things are coming together more. So I'm gonna open our meeting, the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future, the State and Municipal Statutory Plan Process Working Group. This is our October 27th meeting, hard to believe. And just for purposes of freedom of information, since we're all on Zoom, I'm just gonna have everyone just say in 2 lines your name and role. So no long introductions, but that way everyone knows and is able to identify as they're listening in. And then we're going to dive right into agenda item 1, which is discussion of the draft outline of recommendations. So I'm going to start with, it'll go John, then Lynn, Rebecca, Eric, and Kyle.
Thank you, Representative John Board. I guess New Britain, Connecticut. Are we just going to say where we're from?
Just simple, yeah, simple affiliation, title, or where you're from, whatever works. Thank you.
Sure. John Board, New Britain, Connecticut, member of this commission, previous municipal government experience. I guess why I'm here.
Perfect. Then Rebecca, then Eric.
Lynn Haig, City of Bridgeport Planning Director.
Rebecca Auger with OPM.
Eric Lindquist, also with OPM.
Kyle Shield, Principal Planner, Capital Region Council of Governments.
Thank you all. I'm going to go next to Kevin, then Rachel, then Chip, and Charles.
Hi, Kevin Alvarez, Deputy Chief of Staff, City of New Haven.
Hi, Rachel DeSenza, New Canaan, Connecticut. Corporate background.
Wonderful volunteer. Chip, Charles, then
Chip Beckett, Glastonbury, private citizen.
Charlie Gardner, Newtown, Connecticut, attorney and municipal government.
and finally, John, are you able to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. John Guskowski, planner with Tyche Planning and Policy Group and government relations officer with Connecticut Planners.
Awesome. And we have Ashley and Cameron here supporting us also behind the scenes, which has been amazing. And thank you to both of them. So agenda item number 1 is the discussion of the draft outline of recommendations, which you all should have received. And I'm going to, as with a number of things today, but I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca, actually, to put you on the spot, if you don't mind. I want to just also say to the group, as you know, this is a busy time of year for those of us who are elected people. And Rebecca and Eric and the folks at OPM have been extraordinarily helpful in helping us to keep this conversation moving so that we can have something for our deliverables in early December. So Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So what we did was we tried to take primarily from our last discussion and just put down bullet points of where we think the group was headed. But there are a couple of areas where I think there's a discrepancy in differing opinions that we probably really should talk through today. So I guess the best way maybe to just start section by section, and I'll highlight where I think there's some differing opinions. So the first overall section of recommendations is on transforming the C&D plan into a visionary and objective setting plan based on current data and analysis, and that it would establish long-term desired land use outcomes, perhaps a 20-year horizon or so, but analyze existing conditions and trends and set objectives for the life of the plan, which is a 5-year plan. So not recommending a change to the actual horizon of the plan itself. And that here's where there, I think, is differing opinions amongst us in items D and E under this first heading. The plan could direct state spending and other actions to support these objectives, which would be specific and measurable, while encouraging flexibility in how those objectives are achieved and, enable agencies to be responsive to changing conditions. And, or it would make policy recommendations to direct land use decisions at the regional and local level and seek to obtain consistency among levels of government through some means. And I think we have heard the pros and cons of both of those things. And so I'd like to open it up for discussion on whether the plan, well, first of all, if this overall recommendation of making it a more visionary and objective setting plan is what this group is headed for in terms of its recommendations, but also is it directed primarily at state activities? In other words, agencies, spending programs, those kinds of activities. Is it also directed at regions and towns, or is it directed at regions and towns? If you want to run the discussion, Representative, that would be helpful.
Yep, I will do that. I was just about to say, Rebecca, I'm happy to do that. So John, I saw your hand, and to be followed by Rachel.
Sure. So for background, I've met with multiple municipal officials from both small towns and large cities join this process. I sent in a list of recommendations to Representative McCarthy Vahey, but specifically to this point and to the discussion point, Rachel, one of these 8 recommendations was around the timing of POCDs and potentially, like we said, extending the shelf life, maybe 15 years with, I know the previous discussion that Chip was having with a potential 5-year check-ins. But the main thing is really establishing a schedule, a cycle of towns to submit them. So for it to be honest, on a stretched out cycle, and we can discuss how to make that recommendation possibly between rural and between a mix of rural and urban, or if it's by population, etc. So that's something that I know a lot of the officials I spoke to said that might be helpful rather than having it all be at once and all going and putting additional stress on OPM. So that's just one of the recommendations. But like I said, the representative has the others.
And John, I want to thank you for that, and apologies that I wasn't able to connect with you before this meeting, but hope that we can continue this conversation both here today, but also on offline afterwards, as I think a number of us will have some of those kinds of conversations too. So Rachel, followed by Chip, and then Kevin.
Thank you. So I think my first comment's on C, actually, to back up for 1 second. To me, it kind of conflicts with the concept that I think we are aligned with it being kind of this visionary, long-term document. The word specific, having very measurable and targets in it, that's not a visionary document, right? That's as you get down lower levels of how you're going to execute. That's the implementation and the execution documents. That's not that high level visionary document. Now, you want something detailed enough so that you can measure against it. But to me, I think that language needs to be changed a little bit and C. But going to D and E, I mean, I think it's almost, if it's going to be aligned, if you're going to tie it together, I guess, how am I going to say this? If it's going to be directed kind of a top down, then I think it's a 3-legged stool, right? You need to make sure that, and I know you get into it later a little bit more, but the legislative, the plan and the financial piece, the agencies, providing the funding need to be aligned, and it needs to be kind of laid out in the plan. If not, then it's less directive and it leaves more ability, almost as it is today, right? Then I think if you're not going to have it that tight and that clear in the plan, then I think you need to allow for the municipalities and the regions to do as they can based on their ability, depending on where you go with it. Just my input.
Thank you, Rachel. Chip and then Kevin.
I don't know that D&E have to be exclusive. I think if you have a visionary plan with milestones and state agencies all said that they want to implement it, and then we would charge the regions and localities with implementing it as far as they get state funding, but you could give them the discretion about how do they do it. I know I talk a lot about pedestrian and alternative transportation because I think it is a good example, but if somebody wants to build a 10-foot by 2-minute bikeway or multi-use path, do we care versus a 4-foot concrete sidewalk? I think that's up to the towns and the regions to talk about how they do it. But the fact is that there's a connection between towns is the important thing from the state and the region standpoint. So I think they should be integrated, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Thank you for that, Chip, and for the specific example. I think that's helpful too. Kevin.
Thank you. And I think I very much agree with Chip. I think the way that in our meeting, when I spoke to Rebecca about this, I'm actually amazed by how well she captured some of the challenges that we discussed, particularly in Part D, the idea that, and I think that sort of some of the tension that I'm struggling to articulate is, I think the visionary component of this, that it's a sort of 20-year time horizon that is set out at the start of this plan, is over this period of time, we're trying to get to a place where we have done X amount to create greater connectivity via transit. We've done X amount to increase housing stock, X amount to preserve land and water resources, all of those that are a 20-year time horizon that are very sort of big and visionary. And then each of the 5 years, which is the actual practical parts of the plan that is sort of continually reviewed, are those the ways to practically get there on the state side, combining the state and the local and regional side, and the sort of steps towards that longer term progress. And then the thing that I think was really well articulated was that state agencies and the executive branch need to be able to respond to things that happen in those shorter timeframes, much shorter even in terms of the year, that will change economic realities, might change physical land use realities, all of those things that we can't anticipate. The legislature might not be the best entity to quickly respond to. So I just first wanted to sort of kudos to that. I think that these work quite well together, just in there's big long-term vision, there's these 5-year timelines of practically moving. Somehow I muted myself. And that the sort of continuous progress and metrics to getting towards that longer term goal are continually being reviewed and met and looked over by both the legislature, and you have the executive branch constantly moving it forward from their side.
Thank you, Kevin, for that comment. I would also like to just say thank you, Rebecca, for capturing the conversation. And these are very difficult balancing acts that we're looking at. And of course, I always like to keep in mind we're working together to provide recommendations. So and then working together and the recommendations part, both, that's the tricky part too, because we're a working group of the broader commission, which then will report to the legislature. So there are a few levels of it. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to respond, either you or Eric, to some of those comments.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I posed it as two opposing of each other, but I think I'm hearing that a mixture of this is guiding state agencies, but also it is guiding regions and municipalities to some degree. through the policies that it sets. Where it really has an impact is through that state spending issue. And then as far as the timelines, I'm just seeing John Board's comments for the first time now, and I appreciate what Chip said. I think what I was hearing, and maybe I'm not hearing it correctly, is that the vision, it was intended to just sort of set out that roadmap of this is where we want to get to. I don't know what that time horizon really should be, but that 5 years is a pretty short amount of time when we talk about land use. So the 5-year is really what are the actionable steps we anticipate taking, or what are the actionable objectives that we are going to try to reach in this time horizon, marching us towards that bigger outcome. Does that, and I just want to make sure that that reflects what we're all thinking. Seeing head nods and thumbs.
I have people nodding their heads, and I say that because anyone who's watching a video of this will not be able to see people nodding their heads. And I do, just because, also same thing in that same spirit. John has shared in the chat, and I'm going to actually read this out loud just because, again, of the public meeting nature, and I will always discourage us from using the chat because of that, not because I don't appreciate what everyone has to say, but I think it would just be helpful for everyone to have this. And those are, there are 8. One is aimed to have the statewide POCD act as a guide. Policies have a history of being too broad or ambiguous, lacking a clear strategy. With numerous statutory revisions, the original POCD has been watered down. Second is accessibility, have a single point of contact for municipalities at OPM. Third is look at Massachusetts model, seems to have a good relationship with municipalities regarding economic partners, transportation, and commerce boards. And my editorial comment, which is they also have a very large GIS office, right, John Guskowski? And Eric Lindquist, Eric with a C. For talking about timing. John, I think John tried to unmute himself to say something there. Extending the shelf life of POCDs. We talked about that.
We're getting there with GIS.
John Guskowski, we can't hear you, so I'm gonna have you, I imagine you're in transit, so hopefully if you get to a spot where you are in better service, I will actually recognize you in a few minutes. I'm just gonna finish reading these again so everyone has access. So extending the shelf life of POCDs 15 years with potential COG check-ins every 5 years and limited ability to track process, establishing a schedule or cycle for towns to submit by rural or urban population. 5, feedback from departments of cognizance. 6, include a budgetary impact, municipal budget and grant opportunities section of the POCD. 7, include a section for micro-targeting plans down to the NRZ level. And 8, establish some best practices or recommendations for engagements. So I think that dovetails nicely with some of the things that are in the outline for today. John Guskowski, did you want to comment?
Sure, thank you, Representative. And I was just
John, I'm going to.
The first thing I wanted to say, Eric Lindquist and I actually just had. Okay, sorry.
No, I'm interrupting because you're very spotty. I don't know if others are having a little difficulty hearing you. I'm seeing head nods. So I don't know if you're able to get in, if you're headed towards a better service area. But I'm sure we all would love to hear what you have to say, but we just can't hear you very well. That's the downside of the format we have. Any others who have not commented and would like to chime in? Yes, reception is bad. I see that for John. Okay. Hang on for just a second, folks. Okay, so I think, I mean, unless there's anything else in terms of discussion, and John, I will say, and Rebecca, I'll come back to you in just a second. John, if you did want to type something in, I'm happy to read it. I know that may take a bit. Rebecca.
I was just going to ask if we want to move on to section 2.
That's exactly where I was going to say. It seems to me the next step is right our second agenda item, which is looking at volunteers to draft recommendations.
Actually, Representative, I was wondering if we could just move on in the draft
Oh,
outline.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm in the wrong document. Thank you. Yes, section 2 of our document.
Okay.
Please do.
So section 2 is about the drafting of the plan and who adopts it. So the recommendation, I think we were hearing, was that it remains an executive branch plan where the continuing legislative committee and OPM put the plan together, OPM as the drafter of the plan. Some of the bullets in here, though, are that maybe that it's slightly more of an iterative process with the continuing committee than the statutes have it as right now, that we continue to have the General Assembly adopt it, partially to solidify a little more intent and commitment to uphold the objectives that are in the plan. That state agencies still would determine how best to achieve any objectives that are set in the plan through their own activities, through their own funding priorities, through their own programs that they develop, but that they are held accountable to OPM and the continuing committee to ensure that all of those activities are consistent with the plan. And then again, bullet D, I think, is where maybe there's a little bit of friction in this group on our commitment to this, but it suggests that COGS and municipalities are guided in their planning and land use decisions through the state C&D plan objectives through the distribution of state funds in support of that plan. Or it could be that they're held accountable to be consistent with the objectives of the plan in some other form. We've heard some differing opinions on that. So I'd open it up for discussion there.
Comments on, yes, section 2. Thank you for refocusing me, Rebecca. John, and then Chip.
Thank you, Representative. I'm not sure if this would be within our purview necessarily, but I was at least looking at the membership of the continuing legislative committee. And maybe this is a question for maybe OPM. Is it within our purview to potentially make recommendations to add outside members like representatives from COGS and municipalities to the committee to ensure that there is local voices besides the leadership of the General Assembly?
I mean, I think that goes back to my comment earlier, John. Just Rebecca going to jump in on that, because I think it's that as the working group, we're making recommendations to the commission, which is then making recommendations. And obviously, when with these recommendations there are going to need to be some legislative actions. So I think that a lot of this, I think it's fair game.
Okay, I was only questioning it just because I haven't looked at this legislature's standing rules, and if it's possible to add outside members to members of the legislative committee necessarily. That's sort of my line of inquiry there. Obviously, I would want additional members, but I didn't know if the rules permitted that.
And I hear what you're saying. So it would be a matter of how, if that group were going to be reconstituted, how that would work, both according to rules and statutory constructions both. And you'd have to look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's all I have for this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Chip, to be followed by Kyle, then Kevin.
Some of the planners will know more than I about the details, but I know there's a lot of requirements in federal spending and state spending that the COGs get and the localities get for what program you qualify for and what you have to do it. But I think the state ought to provide only the carrot, not necessarily the stick, by saying that our funding is limited to whatever projects are deemed to be appropriate. And then COGs and municipalities can pursue whatever other interests they want to do with their own funding, but it's not going to be statewide funding to fund a statewide goal. That'll be their own personal or municipality use for their own municipality. But I think we have plenty of unfunded mandates, and I don't think that more will be helpful to the state of Connecticut.
Thanks, Chip. Kyle, to be followed by Kevin, then Rachel.
Yeah, that's Chip took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say the same thing. The budgetary, the monetary incentive. I think without that, a plan is pretty toothless. So if the stick isn't politically palatable, I think incentives are appropriate. I think it's the only way to make the plan effective. And it gives the towns the freedom to pursue things that might not be in the state's interest. They'll just do it on their own dime. So, but I do think the monetary incentives are important to include in a POCD.
Thank you, Kyle. Kevin, and then Rachel.
I think I very much agree. I'm very much of the mind that I believe that a stick is a good idea, or at least it's politically palatable to me. And I think the idea and the way that D is written, I almost was going to say that the or could be an and, because it's sort of two pieces of it. It's the state is not going to, you are not eligible for this state money if you are not in compliance with the goals set out in this plan. And over these periods of time, you have to conform your policies in some way. There's some accountability to the COGs and municipalities, that there is some consistency. I don't know if those two are necessarily, I think Chip might have said this about something else, but that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I don't know the part in part D that's after the or. I don't know exactly how that would work, is the thing that I don't know if I've wrapped my head around, where the first part makes total sense to me in that there are certain monies that you are not going to be eligible for if you are not aligned with X, Y, and Z in this plan from state dollars. At the very least, you can spend your own money on it, obviously, in any situation. So that was just my thought.
Thanks, Kevin. And I appreciate and would emphasize what you had in terms of the timeline piece. That over a time horizon, if you were to put an and there, I think that would be very critical. Rachel.
I actually have a slightly different view. I think that it almost is a one size fits all then. And I think that what I've understood and the research I've done, that's the approach kind of we've taken, which is why we haven't seen progress in some of the areas, because the funding has continually for certain things, the funding continues to go to municipalities that meet the requirements, which tend to be the larger cities versus the smaller municipalities, the smaller towns. And therefore you see the smaller towns not making progress in certain areas. And so it's like they never get out of it, right? And so they'll never hit the goal, and therefore never then get the funding. And so it's that bad cycle that they get into. And so I feel, so again, my perspective is the business world and the corporate world, you don't get a goal and not get funded for it. So I don't have a project, I don't have a target, a sales target, whatnot, and then not get the funding to put on the sales presentations or do that project or implement that. You get the funding for it. If you don't get the funding for it, you're not held accountable for your goal. And so I have a tough time saying, I think the money needs to follow the requirement. And if you don't get it, because there's not enough to go around to everyone, right? So if not every municipality or town can get the funding, then I think they get a pass until they get the funding. Now, That said, it would be very specific to what, what the state, the executive branch or whatnot wants it to be done for. And should you want your own, then obviously you go on it, should you have additional things in your plan that's outside of the very specific, what kind of is coming top down, well, then you fund that yourself. But I feel pretty strongly that, in order to be held to something, it should be funded. Because again, I'll use affordable housing as a great example. The big cities are well past the 10%. They just keep getting bigger and bigger because they get more and more funding. And the small towns, especially down Fairfield County, they're not getting anywhere because they don't get any funding. Just an example. But there's more than just the affordable housing in that example. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Kevin, to be followed by John.
Yeah, I think I push back to some extent on that characterization of what is happening in the state right now, because I think one area that I would totally agree with is that one of the priorities in the example of housing, but I think this goes to a lot of other things, particularly around water resources, is that one of the priorities that DEEP and the state should be prioritizing is putting more money into expanding water and sewer infrastructure. I think that is 100% something that is clearly something that should be part of this plan. And in many of the cities, in many areas of Fairfield County, in many areas that are more suburban and urban, there is already that existing infrastructure. So those areas might not need to be prioritized. Some of them might, depending on the situation. But so that I think is a crucial thing that is, as a specific example, obviously there's a million others where more rural areas don't have that type of infrastructure. And so a plan like this would evaluate that picture of water and sewer infrastructure and then prioritize funding based off of that. The thing that is problematic that happens right now is that there is no municipality that is losing out on funding because it doesn't have certain land use policies that make sense. So we're putting tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into our transportation infrastructure in areas that are served by water and sewer infrastructure, but that the zoning in those areas forbids multifamily housing. And so it's the state putting huge amounts of money into a state asset and the municipality exercising authority that is granted to it by the state to forbid multifamily and affordable housing from those areas, which is directly against the interests of the overall state. And so it should essentially be an arrangement where part one is we prioritize state funding to achieve these goals. Part two is we stop putting money towards places that are in direct conflict with that goal. I think that's what I think is important to be clear about the dynamic there, and that the progress or lack of progress in terms of housing has nothing to do with access to money right now. It has directly to do with land use policies. There's a huge amount of problems in creating affordable housing with the way that it is funded, both federally, state, and local level. But the actual building or creation of housing is not because a municipality isn't eligible for funds that a city would be when it's a more suburban or rural area. That's just not how state law works right now.
Rachel, hang on, please wait to be recognized. And no, just because, and more than anything, because of the way the screens go, and so we can make sure that everyone is heard and recognized properly. So I am going to respond, and John is going to go first because his hand was up, but just if you would, and I will say, one of the challenges we've had in this group is over the past 4 years, there's been a tremendous amount of emotion related to the conversations around housing, zoning policy, funding of housing, affordable housing. I've sat in this room for 24 hours at a time, actually, with some of you through that. And I think it's been a challenge in our group as we've tried to talk about this, because the plan of conservation and development includes many, many things, affordable housing being one piece of that. And I think we have that challenge of the objectives that the state, the objectives that the federal government has, frankly, for some of those things, whether it's with transportation, certainly the COGS, using transportation dollars, which primarily come from the federal government, the water and sewer infrastructure, housing, as Chip said, bike and pedestrian. So I think we can easily go down that rabbit hole with the affordable housing conversation. And I do want Rachel to give you a chance to respond. I will, but I'm going to invite us to use examples as we have, but let's, try and stay on that on the plan conversation. However, all that said, I recognize why, because this is where the rubber meets the road. If we're really going to use these documents, rather than just have them for the sake of having them, then I think that's what I've been hearing most of all from everyone. We're not sure exactly how we get there, but what we all seem to agree on is that we want a meaningful document that is actually workable, that we can sink our teeth into, even if we have areas of disagreement, but it gives us a way to more proactively engage and really, really think about, where we want to be, who we want to be, how we want to be. So John and then Rachel.
I'll yield to Rachel, so then we can close the loop on this discussion, then come back with my comments.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Rachel, and then John.
Thanks, John. I actually wasn't going to respond on the affordable housing. I actually was going to go exactly where you were going, is again, using New Canaan as an example. We do need to put, so it's the being able to get the funding for all the other infrastructure, right? So and we talked about this when I had my one-on-one with OPM. We had a fantastic conversation outside of affordable housing. It was about the infrastructure needed, and that's really step one. And the smaller towns not having the funding, and so having it in your plan as kind of that first 5-year goal, and tying the funding to that. So like New Canaan, water and sewer, the train, the rails between New Canaan and Stanford need to be redone. The firehouse is about to collapse. I mean, all of this and not having enough people and stuff, all this infrastructure is so old and antiquated, it can't handle kind of the next step. So that's exactly what we spoke about. And because there isn't the funding, and because we're not there yet, and how much needs to be done, because you walk into New Canaan, you're like back into the 1920s, that's the first step to then get to the broader, 15, 20-year horizon. So I agree. There's a lot to be done, but until you have the funding to tie to that, you can't move forward. And especially we're dealing with some other things. So that was my point. I actually wasn't going to affordable housing. So thanks.
Thank you. John and then Kevin.
Thanks there. Hey Rachel, I just want to give you the opportunity if you wanted to there, but for the second time, just to follow up on Rachel's previous comments and to sort of flush out my budgetary impact line a little more. What I've heard a lot is municipalities want the opportunity to almost develop a wish list to include in their plan to help legislative delegations and OPMs find grant opportunities, and to also help legislators get money back to their municipalities. So it's almost like when we do this longer extended planning from 5 years to 15, 20 years, they almost develop their own sort of what would be their ideal grant situation to help with planning, both from an OPM perspective and also try to help their respective legislative delegations, both state and congressional.
Thank you, John and Kevin.
Just the last thing on this, and I think actually Rachel and I agree to some extent on this, and why I think the language that was included here makes so much sense, because those two things being paired together in the longer term plan, I think is a good thing. So it's saying, okay, in the town of New Canaan is the example, you need upgraded water and sewer infrastructure, you need more transportation dollars for the train station to increase capacity to X amount, and in turn, the municipality is going to change the zoning codes to allow for more multifamily housing to pair with that, or change its land use policies around water preservation or whatever the thing is on all of these different things. It's combining the state is going to give X amount of money to achieve this. The municipality is going to change these land use policies. So those two things work together and we can actually achieve what everybody's trying.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to, John Guskowski, as promised, type something that I'm going to read just because of the reception issues he's having. So he says, I tend to agree largely with Chip and Kyle about focusing a bit more on the funding incentives. I agree that towns should get guidance and even a little critique when they are straying from the overall vision. I think the language of the recommendation can be properly phrased to reflect this. Are there others who have not chimed in who would like to? And I hate to put them on the spot, but then please say fast if you wouldn't like to speak, but I'd love to hear what you have to say, Lynn.
Thank you. I'm in agreement with a lot of, with pretty much everything that's been written here, and there are more articulate voices that are speaking that I am very supportive of. So there's nothing that I disagree with yet. I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Who else? And Charlie, right? Do you wanna chime in? You can say no, it's okay.
No, that's nothing really to add beyond what's been said, although yeah, I agree with all the comments about the importance of infrastructure. I think seeing how critical an issue, particularly sewers have been in terms of development, anything the state can do to encourage that and direct funding to that, because that's such a, in so many towns, such a constraint to densification and a genuine health and safety related constraint rather than an arbitrary constraint. I think that's an important, should be an important point of focus for any sort of planning in Connecticut.
Great, thank you for emphasizing that. I think that's good emphasis. Is why one of our working groups is focused more specifically on that area, because it really is huge. Chip?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've heard from small towns about affordable housing, but that they don't have any infrastructure. And I think for the state, it's very expensive to duplicate a lot of infrastructure in our rural areas or places that don't traditionally have it. So I think part of this should be to prioritize where we already have services and we can expand or improve them. Hartford's got 120-year-old water pipes. That's probably not good for a region of 400,000 people that count on those water pipes. That probably ought to be a higher priority than extending out into Union or Canterbury. So I think that does need to be brought into this plan, that rural areas are probably going to stay rural, and urban and suburban areas, at least inner ring suburbs, are probably going to get first dibs on infrastructure and density.
And Chip, I appreciate the honest comment there, which sometimes we as legislators have a difficult time with that. And it's a struggle because, to Rachel's point earlier, that is true. We have that balance between wanting and needing desperately to invest in our cities and really make sure that they are as vibrant and healthy as they can be. And yet, that's the challenge. Then we have 169 communities, which I will say, it speaks to how our communities are going to need, we're going to have to work together more. And that's where I think the cogs really, really come into play. Rachel.
Chip, you make a fantastic point. It's almost like, and maybe this really is the cogs, right? Is looking area by area and saying, again, I'll use New Canaan, you're sandwiched between two, Norwalk and Stanford, two, metro areas that have just redone all their infrastructure, just redone this and that. What makes sense? And again, this goes, I'm thinking about my conversation with OPM, what makes sense to do there? Do we flip what you already have, again, sorry, 1 second, affordable housing to affordable housing versus putting in all new infrastructure? Like it's not one size fits all. Thinking out of the box, town by town, region by region, and really looking at it in that way versus a peanut butter spread saying every single municipality is the exact same. It's really getting creative. And how do you make the words on the page say that? Because we don't have unlimited funds in a state. And so I totally agree with what you said, Chip. It was awesome. Like, how do you prioritize? How do you get the biggest bang for your buck, but still make sure you've got, everyone has what they need? Like, I have a lot of passion around that piece of it, because I think we can, if we don't do peanut butter spread, and if we really look, we could get so far as a state and provide so much to the people that need it. That's where my passion comes in, is getting away from the peanut butter spread. Anyway.
You're making me hungry, Rachel.
Sorry.
Kevin, and then we're going to move on in the document because I'm just aware of time. It just disappears so quickly these days. Kevin, thank you.
So this actually also, from what Chip said, I think is really important when we're talking about that funding piece, because what folks don't often think about in terms of the just simple raising of revenue for these things, and New Canaan and New Haven are a really good example, because New Canaan is a roughly 20,000 people in population around there. New Haven is 134,000, and 1 mil in New Canaan generates the same amount of revenue as 1 mil in New Haven. And so because the value of the property there is so much more, and 60% of New Haven is non-taxable property. So in the ability to raise revenue and in crafting these policies, the state needs to be aware of, this is how much, based off of the property tax, which is the only real revenue raiser that a municipality has in its toolkit, what is one municipality capable of doing versus what is another town? And that's how to help prioritize those spending decisions.
Right. I'm going to let Chip have a quick comment, and then we're going back to Rebecca. And Chip, you're muted. Chip, can you unmute?
Sorry. I've advocated for years for tax reform because I think the state needs to be able to do these things on a statewide prioritization instead of telling every town they need to pay for these expensive infrastructure costs that really have as much regional impact as they do local impact.
There we Chip again with like hitting the nail on some of the most difficult but important conversations. Rebecca, I'm going to turn it back to you so we can go back to, we've got sections 3 and 4, actually, and 5 to get through if we can.
I think if we can get through 3 and 4, that's helpful. So section 3 is about the process of developing and engaging stakeholders in the process. Just recommending that the continuing committee and legislative leadership and the governor and administration is involved early on in the process to help set that vision, that longer term look, but also that they're brought into the process periodically to make sure that they're buying into it, because it's on them really to ensure that it's implemented. The process include collaborating with state agencies throughout, especially if this becomes a more data-driven plan. They are the keepers of that information, and so they need to be involved throughout and help set those more measurable objectives. And of course, engaging with COGS, municipalities, advocacy groups, and the general public throughout.
That sounds great to me, and a good kind of summation. It's a back and forth process, and the more communication you have, the better. Are there comments on that section, Kyle?
Yeah, just briefly. I'm coming from a municipality. I'm new to CROG here for the past few months. So I can see both sides, because really COGS are essentially toothless when you get down to it. So the state has authority, localities have authority. So we're trying at CROG trying to figure out how the regional POCDs can be helpful and informative. So I actually talked with Rebecca about this morning. I think the approach we're kind of thinking about is, can it serve as the connective tissue between state plans and local plans? You know, you build up from the 169 towns, and how do you connect it to state plans? Do the local plans jive with the Governor's Council on Climate Change or the DECD Economic Action Plan? So can the regional plans, in other words, make the existing plans, and there's a multitude of them, can they make them talk to each other, interact with each other, so they're not in complete disalignment with each other? So I don't know if we figured out our approach regionally, but that's something we're talking about and trying to work out.
Oh, thank you for that. It's in a sense, we're talking about cogs as translators. I like the connective tissue. Having suffered a foot injury, I can very much relate to that and relate to how painful it is when that connective tissue doesn't work. Lynn.
I would agree with Kyle. I think that the cogs really are a critical piece here. And they're not used to, or they haven't been given the authority to really be a true regional planning agency. They're still focused, at least the ones that I interact with, are really still focused on the transportation side of things. They're really not, so we'll bring up affordable housing. They're really not willing to run into that arena because they're just not equipped, and they also don't have the authority to start issuing carrots or sticks or any of that. So I think the cogs become critical here because their plan definitely needs to connect and be consistent with the state plan. So if otherwise they can't access money either. So we talked about earlier, it's okay for the municipalities to have something in their plan that's not really consistent with the state. It just means that if they're moving forward on that, they need to use their own money. But when you come to a cog, they really don't have that, or shouldn't have that wiggle room to be inconsistent with the state plan. I think of, some of the statements that I've heard are in one particular cog plan related to affordable housing. And I think, what? How were they allowed to say these things that are just so segregationist? And it's just not right. And so if there was that accountability factor here for the cogs, I think it would make a big difference.
Thank you, Lynn. Kevin, then John, and Rachel.
I first totally agree with Kyle, and I think cogs as this sort of connective tissue, and same with Lynn, cogs as this connective tissue, I think is a really important part of this. I was curious if the scope of our charge would be as such that, in addition to these recommendations about how the plan is developed, that one of the recommendations that I think would be a reasonable one is that the legislature or somebody evaluate the current structure, design, and role of the cogs, so that they most effectively can, as part of these recommendations of how the state plan of conservation development work, that the cogs are actually designed in a way that aligns with that. Because CROG being, at least in my experience, was the is definitely the largest, but is the most capable cog to actually carry things out. And that's not a comment on any other cogs or their staff or anything. It's just designed in a way and has this a much larger sort of charge of towns, that it's able to function in a way that other cogs are not. And in attending, I think I've attended most of COG, at least most cogs in the state, they all function entirely different from each other. And there's bizarre things like when Lynn's talking about some of the segregationist comments of some, there's a circle drawn around Bridgeport for the cogs. Like it's insane that we have a cog system designed as it is, structured as it is. And so I think along with this, I don't know if it's appropriate for us to also suggest that somebody take a look at how they're structured, because that's how they should be structured is in our chart, but that they could play a significant and important role in the planning, conservation, and development as connective tissue if they were designed in a way that was more functional or better to suit the needs of what we're trying to achieve.
I love, we're going to talk about how we tax in the state, how we structure government, all the small issues here. And
those little things.
Yeah, but I would say this, Kevin, to respond to that, in as much as it connects to the work that we're doing, and how the state plan is developed and done, then yes. As long as we're staying focused on what this means for the state plan. I'll let you advocate in other areas for the broader piece of that. John, then Rachel, then Chip.
I will be quick here. One, I concur with Kyle's comments. I think we all can all rally around our cogs in different ways. And two, let's not also forget the other side of this when we go from cog to states, but let's also look at municipality and NRZs. I think there are ways that we can try to empower our NRZs in our cities as well to try to help play a constructive role here. So like I mentioned, like the representative mentioned previously with my comments, micro-targeting plans down on the NRZ level could be something that's helpful as well. Thanks.
Thank you, John, for that. Rachel, then Chip, and then we're going to move on to number 4.
I'll be quick as well. So I agree. We talked a lot about the COGS being kind of I look at it as top-down oversight, right? Like, and not in like a regulatory oversight, but like, looking across, right? Kind of having that regional view and being able to see and kind of fit puzzle pieces together. Totally agree with that. I haven't heard a lot about this, and maybe they do this, but kind of almost act as a consultant bottom up. So like the municipalities can come to them and say, hey, I can't solve for this within my town. Can you help me? And they then pull in, again, it goes back to that not one size fits all. So how can we solve for this? Or, do they do that today? And if not, I do think that's, that should be part of this. I guess we're not trying to solve for the role, but I feel like that should be, as they're looking at the plan, they should also, as the municipalities are planning, they should be using the COG to do that bottom up consulting role as well, right? So they shouldn't be planning in a silo. They should, where are their gaps? Someone mentioned best practices, I think maybe John did or something, like going to the COGs, almost using them as a consultant too. So it's top down and bottom up. They've got that perfect sandwich position. So as they're building the plan, they should use them there too. I don't know how, anyway, we don't hear a lot about using them as consultants, and I think they're in a really good position to be used as that. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, Rachel, I think some communities don't want to or are reluctant sometimes to have feedback, but I think you're talking about kind of inviting in a different way. So I think that's an interesting conversation.
I think somewhat's how it's posed, like, hey, we're taking a different approach. It's not one side. Let us as a region solve for what that new vision and that new goal. We're going to come together. I don't know. Anyway, thanks.
Well, I was going to say, I was chairman of the CROG for a couple of years and served on it for a long time. One of the big problems to do more is just money. And I would hope that maybe OPM would put more money into the COGs from the agencies so that there was some local control with the municipalities and regions about what's the best way to implement the plans. CROG had an implementation and investment fund, but there was a lot of resistance, especially from the small towns, to pay even another 10 or 15 cents per capita to help fund it, because they would talk about $10,000 or $20,000 they were going to drop out of CROG as dues paying members because it was too expensive for their $25 million budget. I mean, it made no sense in a business sense, but they were very focused on pennies everywhere. And I think that's the big problem. But CROG does some service provider things. We wanted to do a lot more back office service provider things, but there's not the money to stand those things up with the runway that you need for investment. When we talked about appraisals, when we talked about building officials, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars to run for 3 or 4 years so that people can opt into it and you have a viable program to do it. But it could be done if the state would offer the money, because COGs have no way to raise money directly.
So the funding is the piece, and municipalities have to be willing to work together. And I can tell you, in working with some of my colleagues on this issue, that's one of the big pieces of resistance too. Certain places are more willing to do it than others, but I will move us on to item 4 and see if we can get through part of that before we need to adjourn. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rebecca.
Okay, I think we've been talking about 4 all along here, which is really around implementation and ensuring implementation of the plan. I think I would add to this now based on some of the discussion today, but as it's written in what was distributed, it's broadly requiring that state actions be consistent with the plan and that there is a commitment of enforcement, because I would say that right now, the state actions are supposed to be consistent with the plan, and that perhaps we've fallen down on our commitment to adhere to that. So this would include, day-to-day operations and initiatives of state agencies, but also discretionary funding to COGS and municipalities, as well as state bond commission funding. And then creating a second bullet under this is creating a continual feedback loop, so that rather than waiting for these 5-year intervals, that there's this back and forth between state agencies and the continuing committee, or some legislative leadership to provide opportunities to address any hurdles that may arise as state agencies develop their ways of achieving the objectives set out in the plan. Perhaps they run into policy hurdles or financial hurdles or the like, that there is this forum for interaction. And if there's a need for the legislature to act, there's the opportunity to get that in front of them more quickly. It's not intended to develop another bureaucratic or administrative burden on anyone. It is intended to really just open that forum for more back and forth between the group. And then finally, continuing with annual performance measurement reports, which would be more data-driven, one would hope, and incorporating those overall assessments in subsequent versions of the plan, so that you start with how did you succeed with implementation of the last plan when you dive into the next iteration.
Thank you, Rebecca. Comments? I'll just name the challenge that the continuing committee has had just gathering, and the balance between the work of the legislative committee planning and development. And sometimes, whether that's staffing or as legislative leaders, there have been a few just logistical issues. And, I'll speak to that even with this working group. Rebecca, having you and Eric really help frame and provide some of the backbone for this conversation has certainly helped guide us. And I think that's the challenge, because the continuing committee is a legislative body, but it does not have the same framework behind it that you do at OPM. So I just name that as a challenge. But are there other comments from others? Do we have the capacity to continue on to number 5? Are you guys good to continue? I see heads nodding slightly. Rebecca, how about you?
Yeah, so I think number 5 was a bit of a placeholder, because it's for legislative recommendations, meaning for this upcoming session. And I think some of this is going to depend on the actual recommendations that precede. So I think there are things that we might want to recommend for the upcoming session in terms of the particular section that lays out what needs to be in the plan. That could probably be cleaned up and be more clear on an intended new direction for the plan, as well as maybe some of the milestones that are enshrined in the statutes as far as the development of the plan. I also think, though, that we can't get too far in those recommendations. There may be other things that need to be changed or should be changed, but that will not become clear until the plan is under development. And I'm thinking specifically around one area might be the actions that are required to be consistent with the C&D plan. Those are spelled out in statutes. That may need to be looked at again. The way that the locational guide map and priority funding areas are established, that would probably need to be looked at again, but I don't think this group is capable of making recommendations on that until a C&D plan process is underway.
That makes, oops, I didn't realize that. It's not muted. That makes sense. And I think we are going to need even just above, dive a little bit more in. And this will definitely be an evolving conversation. There's no question about it. But one thing that I forgot to mention when Kyle, you spoke, first of all, congrats on your move, or, sorry for the community who lost you. But I was remembering you came many months ago, you were talking about presenting, engaging with the public for the municipal plan of conservation and development, and all the many ways that you guys had set forth to engage people, and then the difficulty of doing so in the end, right? I will just name that also with the state plan of conservation and development process, that we are going to have to think very creatively. I know this isn't exactly on the legislative recommendations, but I forgot to mention it earlier, about how we continue to engage. No matter what we do, there are going to be people upset with the process and feel that they did not have a voice. However, I do think that that's a challenge for us in terms of, the reaching out. And, I give credit to every community like you did, Kyle, trying to continue to come up with the best ways to have the voices. I also will say that, acknowledging that no matter what, I'm out knocking on doors every day for the past many months. Well, not every day because I broke my foot, that was a bummer. But people have different ideas of what the roles should be for our state and for our towns and for our cities and for our neighborhoods. And that's where that, we take in all of these different ideas and then we come to the best consensus that we can, knowing that there will be tension in that, and knowing that the needs of communities and the wants are sometimes different even within a community itself. And I think specifically as my example about our shoreline, and think about Florida and what happened. What we know that Mother Nature, she will always win, and yet we fight her. And how do we have those also difficult policy tensions addressed as we try and go through the conversations that we have with the various stakeholders? So I just, I put that out there as we think about how this whole process and conversation evolves. Any final comments? I know we obviously, this is a document we're coming back to. This was, our another iteration. But before we move on, we actually move on to our next agenda item. Are there any other comments? No, again, thank you, Rebecca and OPM, Eric, all of you for what you've done to put this together. Agenda item 3, our final agenda item is timeline and next steps. Our timeline, it's amazing. It's almost November. And our next meeting is actually scheduled for November 10th. I've asked John Guskowski to facilitate the meeting. There's a very good chance that I'm going to be in transit during the time of our meeting, so I will be available as John was today. We'll be trading places. But Rebecca, go ahead.
Question for Ashley, because I think there's another CCDF group that actually was looking at the same exact time for our next meeting.
So the other group will be meeting from 2:30 to 4, and this group will be from 4 to 5.
Great, thank you.
Ashley, let me ask you this. I'm just gonna look really quickly. If we need until closer to 5:30, is that an option for us with the Zoom?
I'm okay with the 5:30 end time, if Cameron is okay with it, and if there's no other conflicts on the CTA calendar, it should be fine.
Okay. Well, we will confirm that because I know, we're at 5:12 right now, and I just know there's some conversation that we need to have. In the interim, I know that there are going to be a number of folks having individual, conversations one-on-one. And I skipped, my gosh, I skipped agenda item 2 entirely. You can see I'm a little distracted. Because in order to do the timeline and the next steps, we need some volunteers to draft recommendations. That's item number 2. So some folks who are willing to really get involved more in between our meetings. Are there any folks who are eager to get involved? And there may be, for example, John. Isn't it great? John left the meeting, so we can volunteer him to do it, right? Everybody's nodding. John, when you watch this later, you'll see. Kevin, are you raising your hand to volunteer?
Yeah, whatever you need.
Anyone else? Chip, I saw you. Were you going to say you were interested in helping?
Well, I'm trying to campaign too between now and November 8th. I'll try and help, but I write like a doctor, so you have to be, we had that class in school, so you have to take that into account.
Rebecca, thank you, Chip.
I was just going to throw out there that I've written down some people's names next to areas, so it may be that we're just calling on you anyway, and if we can talk it through with you, that is also helpful.
Rebecca, thank you. You said it in a slightly different way than I was going to, which is we're coming in for you anyway, because you all have given such great input, both here today and throughout. And as I said before, some of the other folks who have participated in the past, even during the meeting, I did reach out to one of our members, and I'm hoping that we can re-engage those different perspectives in the conversation, especially because our meetings are recorded and if they can watch, that would be great. So, all right, so volunteers and timeline, we kind of did those 2 agenda items together. Rebecca will be, again, spearheading this effort, as Chip referenced, that November 8th date. Don't forget to vote, everybody. But anything else, Rebecca, that you want to add before we adjourn? No, I want to thank you all for staying through till 5:15 and for sticking with this group. It's been an interesting conversation. I know it will continue to be. And I wish you all a wonderful next couple weeks. Happy Halloween too.
Thank you.
All right.